you think about rivalries, you think about everything around you, and you're like, do you really like your rivals or not? If you like your rivals, then who else do you hate and all that? Of course, for me, being a Toronto Maple Leafs fan, I know damn well who our eternal rivals are, and those are the Montreal Canadiens and all that. Ask a New York Rangers fan who their internal rivals are, and it's the New York Islanders. Ask a Boston Bruins fan who their internal rival is. That's Montreal. Ask a Detroit Red Wings fan, and they'd probably go Toronto or even St. Louis or even Chicago. Los Angeles, who's their internal rival? Maybe Anaheim, because they're both situated in the greater LA area. Dallas, your great Dallas is like, well, who's your internal rival? Edmonton, Colorado? I don't know. But anyway, yeah, every sport's got them. For me, with baseball, my beloved Toronto Blue Jays, my eternal rival are the New York Yankees. Boston Red Sox could be an easy answer, but I don't hate the Boston Red Sox as much as the Yankees. For basketball, it's the Raptors and possibly the Celtics, or even the Nets because of all the times they've knocked the Raptors out of the playoffs, or any team that has LeBron on it. For football, with my New England Patriots, our eternal rivals are the New York Jets, or the Buffalo Bills, or even you can say the New York Giants. And of course, for hockey, it's Leafs and Canadiens. Although I have a massive hate for Ottawa, not for Montreal, as you think I do. But anyway, let's talk about the Montreal Canadiens. I'll do my best to keep the historical factor down a bit. But we're looking at a team that should have been to the Stanley Cup semifinals and making it an all Canadian semifinals and a automatic Canadian team in the final at a time that the country of Canada was in a massive decline. Anyway, let's talk about the 2002. Hello out there, we're on the air. It's Cutter, what if NHL time? Tensions blow, the whistle blown, and the pucks go down the ice. Some teams just want to win the cup and do it with a smile. Hey, that is cool. Up on the River Nile. Oh, the good old hockey game. Who will come out on top? Will a team get through the cup by any means necessary? Oh, the good old hockey game. It's the best game you can name. And I'm have no shame. I will simulate those hockey games. Woo! So the Montreal Canadiens were formed in 1909 by J. Ambrose O'Brien and crew. So Montreal got their hockey team. They played in outdoor rinks and all that. The sport 100 years ago would be very, very unlikable to our modern era. So the fact of the matter is, and no, I'm not wearing red purposely for the Montreal Canadiens because I'm doing tapings. So anyway, the Montreal Canadiens were part of the first ever NHL season in 1917-18 with Toronto and Ottawa. Quebec City had a team, but they folded. So anyway, Montreal were not the first NHL champions. That would be Toronto. In 1919, the Habs won the NHL playoff. And in those days, before 1927, you had to play a Western American team or a Western Canadian team for the rights to the Stanley Cup because it was not NHL exclusive. So the Montreal Canadiens would take on the Seattle Metropolitans, who won the 1917 Stanley Cup and all that. They were the first American team to win the cup. So Montreal and Seattle battled in a 5-game series, 2-2 with one tie. Unfortunately, though, the huge Spanish influenza pandemic happened and people were wiped out. Of course, medicine in 1919 was a whole lot different than 2025. Montreal lost their star defenseman Bad Joe Hall to the disease and their manager, George Kennedy. Montreal was given the chance by Seattle to claim the title by acclamation because Seattle couldn't do it. And Seattle didn't want the trophy either. So Montreal and Seattle agreed no one would get the Stanley Cup. And for the first time in history, the Stanley Cup was refused. 2005 would be the next year. Anyhow, the Canadiens marched along in the 1920s, the Flying Frenchmen. They got Howie Morin somehow from Stratford. And, Georges Vezina, who was playing in rubber boots when Montreal discovered him and made him their star goalie for 15 years. So anyway, the Montreal Canadiens were roaring around. Their second Stanley Cup in team history was 1924. the first 1916. 1925, they had the embarrassment of being the only NHL team to lose to their Western opponents, that being Victoria. So, yeah, 100 years ago, the Canadiens suffered to the Victoria Cougars, and that was the last time a non-NHL team won the Stanley Cup. Montreal would be okay. In the 1930 and 31 season, they won the Stanley Cup twice, taking care of the Boston Bruins, who were supposed to be dominant. But people did not expect Montreal to go through a 14-year dark period, as they will. The city of Cleveland almost got the Montreal franchise before Montreal investors got on board with it. That would have been shocking to see the Canadiens be in Cleveland, of all teams. Montreal also had to fight the Maroons for Montreal Ice because Montreal had two teams. Well, one English speaking, like the Maroons, and one French speaking for the Canadiens. So anyway, Montreal had the problems, and of course, that's when Howie Morenz died in 1937. He got his leg twisted in a collision with a Detroit defenseman, Earl Siebert, and then practically his career was over, and he drank to try to forget it, and then basically had an embolism and died. So anyway, Montreal came through in the 40s. Bill Durnan was a serviceable goalie. Rocket Richard was a respectable player. He had a few bad years, but then he picked up the pieces. Elmer Locke told Blake when he was a player, the 40s, the Habs were pretty good, and they swiped Frank Selke from the Leafs organization. Then the 50s, they dominated through the late 50s because they had a good goalie thing. Bill Durnan turned into Jacques Plante. And then they had Doug Harvey, Tom Johnson, Butch Bouchard, the Richards, as in Maurice and Pocket Rocket Richard, Henri Richard. Jean Beliveau was a part of that team. Elmer Locke, Boom Boom Jeffrion. They were dominant. 5 straight Stanley Cups. No NHL team has even come close to, winning 4 Stanley Cups in a row, other than the others, but still. The 1960s, they were decent and all that. They got Gump in net, and then, they parlayed into Charlie Hodge, who parlayed into Ken Dryden. Montreal would be a dominant team in the 60s. Well, at one point, after losing the 67 Stanley Cup final to the Leafs, Montreal and Toronto both had 13 Stanley Cups. Unfortunately, since then, the line Toronto 0, Montreal 11. Montreal had coaching problems because Alan McNeil, great coach of the 71 Cup winning team, could not get around Pocket Rocket Richard. Basically, they thought it was French versus English, and McNeil was dumped off for Scotty Bowman. Ken Dryden came out of effing nowhere to be the star goalie at 6'4". He was very tall and all that, and agile. And Boston of 71 was supposed to crush Montreal, but they fucked everything up thanks to the tall giraffe, if you will. Montreal did well in the 70s. Guy Lafleur, Serge Safar, Larry Robinson, Kitchener. Sorry, I had to say that for Kitchener Ranger. Guy Lapointe, Steve Shutt, Pete Mahovlich, Jacques Lemaire, Mario Tremblay, Yvonne Lambert, Rick Chartraw was on that team. Doug Reisfeld, both former Kitchener Rangers as well. Ken Dryden with Buddy LaRocque, great goalie tandem. They won 4 cups in the late 70s. Guy Lafleur, of course, was Guy fucking Lafleur. And then Montreal went through a dark period. They lost to the North Stars in the 1980 quarterfinals. They couldn't find their footing, losing playoff matchups by the worst ways possible. And in '86, a young rookie goalie by the name of Patrick Waugh helped the Canadiens win the Stanley Cup against all odds. They were heavily underdogs in every shape or form. They beat Calgary in 5. Waugh was named the Conn Smythe, a.k.a. playoff MVP champion. And Montreal looked good. 89, they should have won the cup, but Calgary beat them. Lanny McDonald getting the last laugh. And Montreal in 93, they weren't really the best team around. Everyone wanted Patrick Waugh traded. Montreal people were not happy. And when Waugh botched the first 2 games of the 93 Stanley Cup first round against the Nordiques, everyone wanted Red Light Rasico in that. Like you want Andre Rasico in that. Are you fucking nuts? The fact of the matter is that, Patrick Waugh had the trust of Jacques Demers, and Montreal won not 1, not 2, not 5, but 10 straight playoff games in one season, mind you. Sure, they lost to Quebec once in overtime, in game 1 in overtime, but then they won Games 3 and 5 against Quebec in overtime. They won games 2, 3, 4 against the Sabres in overtime in their sweep. And against the Islanders, they beat them 3 times in overtime. I think 3, right? No, sorry, that can't be right. 2 against Quebec, 3 against Buffalo, and 3 against LA. So 2 times against the Islanders, sorry. And then 3 times against the Kings in games 2, 3, 4. Of course, the Martin McSorley incident still resonates in minds. But what's more than that, it overshadows John LeClair, who once was a Hab, scoring back-to-back overtime playoff goals in the Stanley Cup Finals. Are you freaking nuts? Oh, well, overtime goals. So anyway, the Montreal Canadiens, after 93, who would think that that would be their last Stanley Cup in team history? They actually had the most championships of any of the big four teams until the Yankees surpassed it, only in 1999, though. But yeah, the Habs have been struggling ever since. They've had some good goaltending. Carey Price, when he was healthy, was Carey fucking Price. Sure, he has the most losses in Montreal Canadiens history as a goalie, but the dude, if it wasn't for his heroics, the 2021 Habs would not have upset the Leafs in the first round of the playoffs. Don't hate the player, hate the game. Of course, Montreal has had a good chance. They fell in the first round to Washington. I picked them to beat Washington because I'm like, Montreal's going to pull off an upset, and Washington's always overrated. But anyway, let's talk about a Montreal team that should have done well, the 2002 squad, and having some moments. All right, so the 2002 Montreal Canadiens, this was their 93rd season. They missed the playoffs in the last 3 seasons, and this was around the time in which Montreal almost lost their franchise. Well, they were sold to an American by the name of George Gillette, who once owned the Seals in the NHL and the Harlem Globetrotters. But George Gillette was a smart guy, not part of the Gillette shaving company and all that. But the fact of the matter is that Gillette was the guy, and he kept the team in Montreal and didn't want to move it. So that's good news. All that. Unfortunately, though, the season did not start off well for Montreal because Saku was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. He had to miss all but 3 regular season games. Doug Gilmour was signed away from Buffalo to address the absence. But Jose Theodore started to pick up where he left off. Montreal picked up Donald Odette from Dallas for Benoit Brouet. You know, Jose Theodore took matters in his own hands, mostly after the NHL season was on hiatus due to the Winter Olympics in 2002. He put up 30 wins, 24 losses, 10 ties, and 7 shutouts. And for some odd reason, Theodore, well, sorry, they fed it, yeah, that didn't, well, he won 30 games. Montreal only won 36 games. I'm actually shocked he won the Hart Trophy for MVP. But Saku Koivu returned from treatment and played against the Ottawa Senators in the third last game of the regular season on April 9th, 2002. Reason why? Because some kid in Plaza, Ontario was celebrating his 17th birthday. That was me. So anyway, he played for the team for the rest of the season. And the Habs weren't the best team around. They were 4th in their division. The Bruins put up 101 points. The Leafs were so close. They lost it with 100. Ottawa picked up 94 points and Montreal was 87. Montreal survived Washington's attempts to make the playoffs and made it in by just 2 points. Carolina had only 91 points, but because they were playing in a crappy division, and the top 3 and the 3 division winners were 1, 2, 3, Carolina would have been 7th by points. Nevertheless, the Habs had a great season. They were 5-2, and then they took on the Boston Bruins, best team in the East. A lot of people thought that Montreal was going to get overmatched. However, Donald Odette put up a hat trick. It was 5-2. Boston won game 2, and then game 3, Koivu with a 4-point performance, including rocking the Molson Center with a massive 2-minute standing ovation. Boston won game 4, but Jose Theodore put up a game 5 victory in Boston, and then game 6, Yannick Pro gave Montreal the 2-1 win. And let's not forget about Jose Theodore's stick swing save off of, I think it was Guerin or Rolston. I think it was Rolston. But anyway, Montreal would face Carolina, and everyone thought that Montreal was going to take care of Carolina and move on to the conference finals. The Habs were up 3-0 in Game 4. All they needed to do was hang on. They would be up 3-1 and pretty much have a stranglehold on the conference final spot, which would have been huge because the 2002 Habs would have faced the winner of Ottawa Toronto, because Ottawa and Toronto were the other conference semifinal. So we would be guaranteed to see a Canadian team in the Stanley Cup for the first time in 9 years, 8 years, excuse me, Vancouver. But unfortunately, Nick Wallin and the Canes, with that three straight game, the Molson Miracle, Montreal lost to composure, especially Gilmore in Game 6, slamming the penalty box door so much it shattered. So just going to show you the stuff and all that. So yeah, they looked pretty good, but then they choked. They really choked. The Molson Miracle. Yeah, the highest point total for the Habs was Pro with 56 points. That really shows you a lot. In the postseason, Stefan Fiset was actually the backup. Jeff Hackett was the backup, and then he got traded. They didn't know what to do without Jose Theodore. Koivu won the Masterton for top player through perseverance. Well, dude, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, coming back from the same disease as what nearly failed Lemieux a decade earlier. Jose Theodore won the Hart Trophy and the Vezina for goalie and MVP. And quite ironically, as of this taping, Connor Hellebuck was the 2025 Hart Trophy and Vezina winner. I kind of think that if you add playoff performances, definitely not Hellebuck. But that's not what it is. So there were trades. Montreal picked up Joey Juneau in June 2001 from Phoenix, Stephen Quintel, a Quebec boy from Chicago, Donald Odette for Brendan Brule and Brzezinski, Sergei Berezin from Phoenix for Brian Savage and a third-round pick. They picked up Yannick Perot off of the Leafs in free agency for 3 years, Doug Gilmour from Buffalo. They did lose some players, but not really any key players. In the 2001 draft, they drafted Mike Komisarek, 7th overall from the University of Michigan. And then they picked up Alex Parrish-Hogan, who was supposed to be this good guy, 25th overall, but he got involved in a AHL incident. I think he was the victim, wasn't he? Six-wing incident. Yeah, Garrett Stafford of Cleveland in the AHL playoffs put Parrish-Hogan through convulsions. He lost him teeth and was diagnosed with a concussion. Oh no, sorry, it was Parrish-Hogan was the guy who knocked down Stafford, and Parrish-Hogan was suspended for the entire AHL 2005 season. So he was the aggressor. That's my fault. Duncan Milroy was also drafted. Thomas Plekanec, 3rd round from Czechia. So that's interesting to know. But anyway, what would happen if the Montreal Canadiens of 2002 beat Carolina and got to the Stanley Cup semifinal? So the 2002 Habs would have faced the 2002 Leafs, of course, because the Leafs ended up being the Ottawa Senators in 7 games in the other conference semifinal. So Montreal versus Toronto, and the winner would face Detroit. As usual, when we do one conference's things, we don't change everything for the other conference. So Montreal Toronto game 1, 2002 would have been a Toronto win. Andrei Markov would have scored to make it 1-0. Ty Domi, of all people, would have tied it. And then it would have been double overtime. Montreal had 4 penalties, and on the 4th time, Brian McKay finally scored on the power play, and in double overtime, Toronto would have beaten Montreal. Even though it was double overtime, Patrick Poulin only got 8 minutes. Eric Laundrie took 5 minutes. Sheldon Survey, 5 minutes. Well, this was before he was a superpower. Mike Ribeiro, 3:43. The Leafs, Nick Enderpuff only got 8 minutes. Belak only got 5 minutes. McCauley only 5 minutes, which was stupid. Of course, this is full strength Matt Sundin, Shane Corson, Michael Redberg, when they're not hurt. Anders Eriksson, Carl Pilash, and Paul Healy also played. Cujo and Tador, the 2 stars, obviously. Andrei Markov, the 3rd star. So, yeah, these 2 goalies would battle each other through double overtime. Game 2 had Toronto win by a score of 5-2. Corson against his former team would have made it 1-0. Michael Renberg, Darcy Tucker, Gary Roberts, and Travis Green would have done the job. Tador replaced by Oli Michaud. And then Richard Shatnack and scored twice, and that would have been it. Renberg, Michaud, and Sednik, the stars. They put Michaud the second star for saving 34 shots in relief. Wow. I would have given it to probably Gary Roberts with 2 points. But that's not my decision. So anyway, game 3 at the Molson Center would see Montreal lose 2-1. Close one. Tucker and Dacko with canceling goals, but in the third period, Gary Roberts came through. And Toronto again with Cujo being the hero. Cujo, Taylor, and Tucker, your 3 stars. So yeah, Cujo would have played out of his fucking element. Montreal down 3-0. They don't want to go with Stefan Fiset. He brought him there, Jose Taylor, and it's gone. Cujo would have played lights out, and the Leafs would have went to the Stanley Cup Finals against Montreal, against Detroit. Sednik scored for Montreal, but Mogilny, Roberts, and Reichel at full strength gave the Leafs a 3-1 win and the sweep of the Habs. I would have thought it would have been Game 7, but yeah, Toronto would have easily used Cujo to stymie Montreal, and the Leafs would have went to the Stanley Cup Finals. Cujo, Mogilny, and Roberts were your 3 stars of the game. But yeah, Cujo would have been like on fire, especially with that double overtime game in Toronto. But yeah, Toronto would have definitely had home ice. The reason why Toronto didn't have home ice against Carolina in the conference finals was because Carolina was the higher seed because of their division. What would have been, the Leafs could have definitely gone to the finals against the Red Wings. Maybe lose to the Red Wings, but at least we make the finals. So yeah, that's interesting to note. Yeah, the Habs would have been mincemeat. And no, I did not manipulate it so that the Leafs would beat the Habs. If so, I would have given Matthew Garon the starting role for Montreal, and I would have put like fourth line guys as the starting line. Not just me. Anyway, I'm Jeff Diamond. I do.